University Chair of the History, Politics, and International Relations Department at Webster University. Well, at this point, I was talking about your role as a visiting fellow at the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the USHMM, where you had pursued the subject of the feeble-minded in Germany between sympathy and persecution. But today, Warren's topic will be the legal system and the Holocaust. It's always a great pleasure to welcome back Warren Rosenblum.
So maybe before I forget, I'll just make that pitch for the Webster University talk. So Shannon Fogg is a professor from Missouri Science and Technical, but she actually chairs the history department there. And she wrote an award-winning book on the Holocaust in France and the playing out of especially the confiscation of Jewish property by the Vichy French government. And I think it's just going to be a really great talk. That's on November 29th, I believe, at 5 p.m. But I'm sure I know Dan posted that newsletter, so that's my pitch for that. I've been traveling a lot lately, and I wanted to say something right off the bat, which is that I've met a lot of people from Holocaust museums in funky places around the country or even in Canada. I just met the education director from the Montreal Holocaust Museum. And when I tell them about our docent, first of all, about how many docents we have, and secondly, about the docent training series and other things, they really are so impressed. And I think we are really lucky to have this. I'm realizing how lucky we are to have this. And I've just had these conversations with people where I tell them about St. Louis and what we're up to, and they, look. I mean, at first I assume they do the same thing where they are, but they don't. They don't get these kind of turnout for middle of the day talks. They don't have this kind of, just amazing pool of people doing tours, working with kids, working with the wider community. So I think what we've got here really is great and pretty special, especially a community that we're not. I mean, compared to Montreal, our Jewish community is tiny, and we're a fraction the size. But I heard the same thing from folks at Jewish museums on the East Coast and elsewhere. So just that's my kind of praise of, Dan, we're still here. I'd be patting you on the back. I'd be saying, and now on to attacking the lawyers. One of my absolute favorite activities. Maybe some of you know that I'm the black sheep of my family because I'm not a lawyer, and proud of it. So it's a tiny bit of an Oedipal mission to sit here ripping lawyers. I always get a special pleasure out of it. So actually, oddly enough, I am going to start with something I learned doing research on the feeble-minded. This is a photo of what was the Jewish home for the feeble-minded. That is, the Jewish home for people with intellectual disabilities on the outskirts of Berlin in Weissensee. And as I was doing research this past summer, I came upon a pretty rich documentation of a Jewish home, which I hadn't until I'd seen most of the homes. Most of these institutions are big, and they're either Protestant or they're Catholic or they're state-run. And what was really striking in this thick documentation, including back and forth with the Nazi government about these Jews with intellectual disabilities living in this home, was how as late as 1941, things just seemed to be going on in the usual bureaucratic way. The Nazi government, or in this case actually the Berlin government, was sending inspectors to come and look at the kitchen and make sure that it was clean and run according to hygienic standards. They were looking at the curriculum of how these adults with disabilities were being educated. And there was even one really long, and in some ways I have to say, kind of hysterically, almost funny correspondence where this Nazi bureaucrat was dealing with a fight between one of the patients and the director. And he was getting correspondence from both, and it was just the most kind of petty, absurd, you know, he's always been out to get me, he's incompetent, this guy, the patient never showers, he's unclean, we have to keep, you know, kind of this back and forth with mutual recriminations, and just kind of, you know, it reminded me a little bit of, again, of my own family, just little Jewish mutual recriminations. But on some level, the absurdity being that this was in March of 1938. And as, you know, in case it's not obvious, this is a time when Jews are being horribly persecuted by the state. It's a policy to persecute the Jews. But people with disabilities are also being persecuted. These people are people with a double burden, you know. And the expectation would be that they've become so marginal, that they're so persecuted. Why in the world is this Nazi bureaucrat sitting there spending his time adjudicating this petty little dispute between two people from this home out in Weissensee? Well, really, it's not that unusual. I mean, one of the oddities of the Third Reich, and I think it's still surprising even for those of us who spent years studying it, is how the legal institutions, the entire system of government, which was very rooted in rules and regulations and legal norms, really kept going. And the fact is that, you know, that of course this story ends very sadly. The people of this home were in fact deported to Travniki in 1942, and that was it. The story ends abruptly right there. The file ends. Doesn't even tell you they were deported. It just comes to an end. But really, up until that moment, partly because they were in this funny sort of situation where they're kind of falling between the cracks, living in this home out in the suburbs, that the bureaucracy just keeps kind of going. It's like a machine that goes by itself. And it seemed to me that that's a pretty good way to get into this theme of the role of law in the Third Reich. Because in some ways, it's surprising and it's odd the way that law and the legal system continue to function. And continue to function as, in my view, and I'll admit there's some disputes here among historians, but I feel pretty strongly that in many ways the legal system continues to have its own version of integrity. That it actually, you know, judges are sitting on benches and they're considering arguments and they're making decisions based on the law. Lawyers are coming before them. People are showing up expecting their rights to be addressed within this special realm of the courtroom. And all that continuing even at a point when we all know that the stormtroopers are wreaking havoc, that the state is pursuing vicious policies of expropriation and persecution, and ultimately, of course, the worst of all the horrors during World War II, the deportation of Jews to the death camps of the East. And kind of in the backdrop is a sort of larger question, which was, what was the character of the Third Reich? You know, was this what we often call it? Was this a police state, a state in which the police was in charge and they could just do whatever the heck they pleased and they were calling the shots? Or was this what the Germans called a Rechtsstaat, a state of law, a state ruled by the rule of law? And in an interesting way, there is a little of both. And I think it's not only interesting, it's not only quirky, like, oh gee, how surprising that these Jews in this home were still getting, you know, bureaucratic legal handling. But I think it's also important to the core story of the Third Reich. I think you'd be giving a distorted picture if you simply said it was a police state, it was a state where there was no law, it was a state where anybody could do whatever they wanted. If you say that, I think you're saying something that distorts the picture. I think it's important to the ability of the Nazis to carry out the horrors that they did and to maintain the support of a very large portion of the German population. I think it's important to that story that in fact they did hold on to elements of legality. Okay, so that's the story that I want to tell. In the end, believe me, I have nothing, really just about nothing good to say about lawyers or about the legal system. So this isn't about somehow apologizing. That's not what I'm about here. It's more simply understanding how did the Third Reich work, and trying to get away from the cliche, which is there in the movies, and I think there in some of our educational materials, the cliche that it was just a simple police state, or as Hitler himself liked to call it, a Führerstaat, a state where just, the Führer made his orders and that was the end of that. It's a little more complicated, and I think in the complication stands something worth knowing. Some of these points might be obvious to some of you, but I still want to underscore them, which is that law definitely mattered. I mean, the creation of legislation, the creation of written legal ordinances was very much a part of how things got done. First and foremost, and I know this is often a question that comes up as you're giving tours, just the question of the fact that it was a legal assumption of power. I mean, Hitler called it a seizure of power, and the Nazis loved to remember it as a seizure of power. By the way, that's right out of the playbook of Mussolini, who did his famous March on Rome, even though, in Mussolini's case as well, it was pretty much a legal assumption of power. Mussolini was invited to take power. Hitler, likewise, you could almost argue that Hitler should have come to power in the summer of 1932, when the National Socialists first became the largest party in the German Reichstag. By rights, he should have been tapped to form a government. He wasn't, because Hindenburg didn't want him in charge of a government, and then it was only later, in January, really December and January, that he does get asked to form a government. But it is a legal assumption of power in the sense that it operates within the framework of the Weimar Constitution. Now you might ask, if it was legal, then why in the world would the Nazis call it a seizure of power? Why would they brag about it as a seizure of power? Just like Mussolini, that was kind of part of their mythology, the idea that they had that this was a revolution. They wanted it, in some sense, to feel like a revolution. It's also the case, just as an aside, as a kind of parenthetical, that while Hitler was put in office through legal means, there was, of course, a wave of brown shirts in every German town, almost in every German city, who were seizing power on the local levels. So while Hitler was tapped to become chancellor, the brown shirts, the stormtroopers, were taking over the city halls, they were crushing the labor unions, they were imprisoning communists, they were doing all these things which by no stretch of the imagination operated according to law. But I do think it's worth saying, we have to say it, that Hitler came to power legally. Constitution. One of their first and most important steps was the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, which essentially threw Jews out of the civil service, made it impossible for Jews to hold any job that was state-related, and also created all sorts of burdens on becoming a civil servant. So it's kind of their way of purging, of cleaning up the civil service. Notoriously, there was the Enabling Act, which was a law that basically said that the Reichstag, the parliament, would no longer have to pass laws, that because of the emergency of the Reichstag burning, that Hitler could have a lot of leeway. The government would stand regardless of whether it had a parliamentary majority, and the government could make all sorts of decrees, even without necessarily turning to the Reichstag. But that was a law. It was voted. You could talk about ways in which it was problematic, but it was still put in the form of law. And then perhaps most notoriously of all, there was the Nuremberg laws. And it wasn't obvious to people that Hitler's government should be creating a law to decide who's a Jew. It wasn't obvious that they should put it in legislation, things like the fact that Jews would no longer be allowed to have non-Jews employed in their household, or that a Jew could not have any kind of sexual relationship with a non-Jew. But it turned out there was a need for it in legal form. That actually at various levels of German society, people were writing to Hitler, they were writing to the Nazis, they were saying, you really need to clear this up because it's causing all this sort of confusion that we don't know exactly who is a Jew. You know, how many grandparents have to be Jewish for somebody to be decreed a Jew? What happens when people have converted? What about this so-called intolerable situation of Aryan women working as maids in Jewish homes? The pressure came from below, and the result of it was to say, this needs to get put in writing. We need this to be in our law books.
When you say the pressure came from below, what does that mean?
Yeah, so from below means that it wasn't necessarily within the federal chancellery, within Hitler's own cabinet, that they were all that interested. Hitler didn't wake up one morning and say, gee, it would be great to have a law restricting Jews' abilities to employ non-Jews or governing all these things. It was that people on the local level said, how am I supposed to decide who's a Jew? In this town, they're saying you're Jewish if you have 2 Jewish parents. In this town, they're saying you're Jewish if it's 3. In this town, they don't have any clarity. And the confusion in a country that really relies so much on legal norms led to, from the city level, from the towns, from the villages, from little organizations, from the welfare office, from the Office of Sports and Entertainment, they're all writing up to Berlin and saying, we need a federal law.
So there's a popular embracing of that law and in German style, wanting to make sure that they're following the detail.
There's a popular demand for clarity from the top, and that putting this in the form of a law would provide that sort of clarity at all levels of society and government.
For operationalizing.
Yeah.
So there was a popular embracing by everything down to the villages to make sure that they were cleansing.
Well, one of the things about the Third Reich that's also worth noting here is that a lot of policy got created on the level of towns and villages, and then only later got adopted by Berlin. So, for example, banning Jews from swimming pools. We can track that and see the first people to do that were, mayors in little towns in Bavaria who said it's intolerable that we are allowing Jews to swim in the public pool. And so they passed a decree forbidding it. You have local school boards deciding that Jews will be kicked out of the schools. You have local apartment buildings deciding that they want their apartment building to be Jew-free. A lot of the important decisions that take us on the road to the Holocaust come from the local levels. And in this case, it was the confusion on the local levels which created a demand for legal clarity. In general, Adolf Hitler had never served in government before. Adolf Hitler was a really poorly educated man with an intense contempt for lawyers and the law. He really didn't like to put things in writing. There's a reason that there's not much of a paper trail for the decisions around the Holocaust, and that because that was not the final decision of the final solution. They did not want a paper trail. They did not want. They didn't have the willingness to put that in terms of law. But there's this other pressure that comes from Germany being a country with an intense faith and reliance on legal norms. Lawyers are really important in German society up to and including the period of the Third Reich, which is kind of my next point, that there's an amazing faith in the courts and in the ideal of an independent judiciary in Germany. That faith becomes tragic in the case of many Jews who go to court after 1933 expecting a judge to help them out, thinking that, as a German citizen, you have a right to access to a judge. And the fact is that faith in the courts and in law runs really deep. Walk around any German town and you'll see these magnificent courthouses, right? And usually the most beautiful building in a town unless they happen to have a cathedral or a really lovely city hall, will be the courthouse. And often it's more than one courthouse. And it's not unusual to see that famous image of Justitia, the goddess of justice, with her blindfold or holding the scales of justice. Even in the time of the Kaiser, before World War I, Germany was known as a Rechtsstaat. It was the very model of a country organized by law and legal norms. And it wasn't unusual for American lawyers or people who wanted to become law professors to go to Germany and study at Heidelberg or Berlin, where have you. Some of our most famous jurists, in fact, read fluent German and studied overseas.
I have a question about
Yeah.
that. I have a question, and there may not be an answer.
Yeah.
But you started off by talking about how unusual was that you're not a lawyer in your family.
Mm-hmm.
So Jews and law have been, millennial.
Yeah.
Going back and forth. So how many, what percentage do we know of where they're Jewish German
Yeah.
attorneys?
Yeah, so it's not millennial. It can be really specific about when Jews and lawyers start getting coupled in people's brains. So this is important too, that so many jobs in Germany were in fact civil service jobs. So many positions were considered state jobs. A professor, for example, is a state job. A judge was definitely considered, being in the state. The government, of course, even back into the 19th century, had an enormous bureaucracy. And so a lot of positions were state positions. And historically, that meant that they were closed to Jews. So already back in the 1850s and the 1860s, as lawyers assert their independence from the state, and as the profession of law carves out a space for itself as an independent profession, it becomes very attractive to Jews. Because these are good jobs, these are important jobs, but they're also independent jobs. And so it's really, it is no accident that we think of there being so many Jewish lawyers. That tradition is old, although it's not that old. It's back to the middle of the 19th century. And there's this explosion of young, of course, Jewish men going and studying law. A lot of them becoming lawyers, some of them becoming going into other professions. There's also a lot of Jewish journalists, and journalism too is a independent space apart from the state, and so it's a happy space for Jews. And finally, the fact that there's so many Jewish entrepreneurs, because Jews often aren't welcome in these big companies, these big famous big German corporations, and they're much happier, not unlike immigrants in our own society here in America, starting their own business and doing something independent. So entrepreneurs, journalists, but then also, lawyers. And in the case of Berlin, which was of course the city with the largest Jewish population, I believe Jews constituted something like a quarter of the lawyers. So in Berlin, it's a huge, huge representation of Jews, and these are in fact some of the most important, if not the most important law firms in the country. The other thing I would say about Germany, especially before the Nazis, but continuing into that period, is that Germany is a very litigious society. So are we, right, when we talk. But in those days, there were two kind of interesting things about people's relationship to the law. One was, it was very easy to sue each other for so-called honor disputes. So if somebody in this room in the question and answer calls me a fraud and a shyster, or let's say one person calls me a fraud and another person calls me a shyster, if we were in Germany, especially in the 19th century or even in the 20th century, I could take you to court and sue you for the insult. And the number of insult suits is just astronomical. It's unbelievable.
The intellectual duel.
And it could be, fighting a duel would be the other alternative. But not everybody could fight a duel or wanted to fight a duel. But you could go to court and you could get, you could get a serious punitive damages for somebody just calling you a name. And unlike the United States, of course, where we have libel, truth was not necessarily a defense. I mean, even if I really am a shyster and a fraud, I still potentially can sue you for the insult to my honor, because even though I'm a fraud, I don't like to be seen as one in public. So it was a very litigious society. People felt a great investment in their courts. And another side of that that's even more unique to Germany is the existence of private prosecution. You didn't have, for a case to go to criminal court, you didn't even have to have the state prosecutor necessarily pursuing it. You could do what's called a private prosecution and simply go and say, you know, this guy, my neighbor, you know, stole from me. The police refused to investigate it. The prosecuting attorney won't take it seriously, but you would have the right to actually bring this case to court. And that's another factor which led to, I think, a very intimate relationship between Germans and their courts. You know, a real sense that these courts really mattered. They had a real place. During the Weimar Republic, there was a brutal knockdown, drag-out fight about the courts. And in some ways, you could say this fight starts with the feeling that judges, most of whom were appointed during the imperial era before World War I, were biased in favor of conservative causes and often were anti-Semitic, certainly were considered to be very sexist and unwelcoming of anything different. But there was just a real conservative mentality. And that's captured in the first woodcut. I don't know how well that comes across, but that's a very critical image of a German judge, that they're kind of petty, backward-looking, and sort of resistant to accepting the ways that German society was changing. And so the Democrats in the Weimar Republic, meaning the liberals, the democratic socialists, anybody who felt that they were invested in this new republic, put a lot of energy into trying to change the judiciary. And the image in the middle is of a sick Madam Justice. The goddess Justitia is in a hospital bed, and she's being tended to by one of the leading Republican politicians of the Weimar era, Otto Herzing. And that's just kind of typical of the Weimar period, this feeling that the courts, as much as you have faith in the courts, and as much as you love your courts, that they still need reform. And that the judges in particular are kind of failing to kind of move forward into this democratic, more liberal era of Weimar. That effort at reform, that criticism of conservative judges, led to a very fierce backlash that the Nazis really used to their advantage. It seems bizarre, but one of the Nazis' most important promises was that they would restore the integrity of the courts, that they would defend these conservative judges who were under attack by liberals, under attack from socialists, and most of all, under attack, in their view, by Jews. And the image on the far right is a typical anti-Semitic caricature in which, and it's not 100% clear that is Lady Justice, but it certainly matches a lot of the rhetoric of the time. In any case, she's been bound, her sword is at her feet, and two Jews are enjoying the financial windfalls of having tied up Lady Justice. There's extraordinary support for the Nazis among non-Jewish lawyers. And it's interesting to speculate on the reasons for that. I mean, one really obvious reason is just sheer opportunism. That given that so many Jews are lawyers, so many lawyers are Jews, that the possibility of having the Jews forced out of the legal profession is pretty advantageous to non-Jewish lawyers. And you see that same dynamic at work, by the way, in medicine, where a lot of so-called Aryan doctors embrace Nazism. But another reason for it is that they, I think, really do believe that they can use law as a tool for social policy. And that if the legal system could be righted, if things could be made right, it could be tweaked properly, that they could use law, the courts, legislation, to carry out that agenda for a strong, nationalist, united Germany. And the numbers really are extraordinary. I mean, in terms of the percentage of leading Nazis who were lawyers, percentage of non-Jewish lawyers were Nazis. I mean, it really is a very intimate relationship. And there's some extraordinary descriptions. If any of you have ever read Sebastian Hoffner's memoir, if you haven't, you should get it. It's in paperback. Defying Hitler, thank you. Fantastic book. He's not Jewish, but he's a liberal young man in 1933 on a path to become a lawyer, and he just describes beautifully how Nazi ideas are just infecting legal circles, including his own study group. And there's an amazing description of how his study group falls apart as one of the guys becomes a hardcore Nazi, one becomes a sympathizer, and another one is Jewish, and Sebastian is in the middle of kind of navigating this situation. But there's a real strong sense that the Nazis are going to restore these conservative judges to their proper authority, and that the Nazis will take away some of the, what people believed at the time were the excessively adversarial qualities of the legal system, that the defense lawyers were becoming too powerful, and that they should be put back in their place, that procedure should be streamlined in the courts, so that the state, the prosecutor, the judge, all had more say over the proceedings. They talked about a kind of racial law, about a kind of folkish law that represented Germany's future and their hope for how Hitler would make their lives better and their lives easier. And I'm just going to check in with Dan. What time would you like me to go until?
Till 2:15.
Okay, great. So the courts don't go away. The courts don't cease to be important. The judges, to a remarkable extent, just keep on judging. And there's two implications to that, really. You know, one is that it puts the judges in an even worse light, because the fact is that judges didn't need to be removed. Judges didn't need to be threatened. Judges didn't need to be bullied. In so many cases, the judges themselves, even if they weren't Nazis, were willing to go along with the spirit of the times. And so the stories, which I'm sure many of you have heard, of Jews facing discrimination when they come before a judge, are simply because the judges felt that Jews actually, in these times, had a diminished level of citizenship. But the courts nevertheless continued functioning, and that meant that there were also cases in which judges act quite heroically. Now, there weren't that many, it would be nice if there were more, but there were plenty of cases in which judges took the side of Jewish defendants, or even of Jewish plaintiffs. There were cases in which judges had a Jewish family come to them and say, our father was, the patriarch of the family was dragged off to a concentration camp, and could you please find out, where he is, kind of in the spirit of our habeas corpus. And interestingly, they don't have habeas corpus in Germany, which has not been explored as much as I think it should. There's no requirement that when somebody is confined, that a judge look into this. I think in America, that's essentially what habeas corpus is, at least based on my dinner table discussions with my father. In Germany, there is no principle of habeas corpus, but the judge has the power, has the discretion to look into people's confinement and to ask, hey, what's going on here? And how does this confinement follow, in fact, the law and legal norms? So it was at the discretion of a judge to consider whether somebody was rightfully confined, and in a few cases, judges really did this. The most dramatic, and I would say the most heroic example, is the guy on the far right named Lothar Kreisig, who was a judge who concerned himself with what was happening to people with disabilities, and the fact that people with disabilities were being held against their will in asylums, and ultimately the fact that they were being sterilized against their will, and then that they were being murdered. And Kreisig refused to back down. He was just a local judge who made a real stink, went all the way to Berlin, demanded to know, how is this policy going forward. He provided evidence that thousands of people with disabilities were being murdered. And ultimately, the Minister of Justice, Franz Gurtner, met with Kreisig and said, are you crazy? What are you doing? Of course, there's an order of the Fuhrer on this, and I can't show it to you. I think, or in the end, I think he may have even shown him the page with Hitler's signature. But Kreisig nevertheless said, well, it's not legitimate law. This has not been passed. This is not proper. And so in the end, Gurtner fired him as a judge, summarily dismissed him. But interestingly, too, Judge Kreisig was not punished for his impudence, for his gall in pointing out that mass murder was taking place. And in fact, I don't know any cases of judges who were punished when they showed
this case came up.
that unfolded in 40, 41. But I don't think I don't know of any cases in which judges were punished for doing the right thing. They were often dismissed. They might be kicked out of the party. Their careers, I guess, were ruined. But they weren't punished. So the decisions, when judges made bad decisions, in our view, when judges did things like, for example, sentenced a Jewish doctor to death because he was accused of kissing a 16-year-old non-Jewish patient, even though there was no evidence that he had actually kissed the girl completely denied that there had been anything improper in their relationship. And even though the Nuremberg laws don't specify that you would be put to death for sexual contact, in spite of that, the judge, using his own discretion, sentenced the doctor to death. And there's many cases like that where judges actually impose a higher sentence. Those are all based on their own judicial decision-making and their own reading. So the courts, the good news is, in a weird sense, that the courts maintain some independence. The dark picture in this is that just makes them even more culpable for the decisions that they made. Yeah.
Sounds like Judy Garland. The legitimacy of decrees. These were not, most of these decrees, my understanding, were just decrees. They were not the Reichstag passing laws. Is that a correct view?
Yeah, so this actually gets me into the next point, which is that, of course, there were all these things going on that had nothing to do with the courts. And there were all these things going on that in the German expression were happening unter Nacht und Nebel, under night and fog, right? And a lot of these things were happening under the SS, under the stormtroopers, the SA, or directly under the police. And so what one scholar has come up with is the idea that in fact what we're dealing with is a dual state. And that while on the one hand the court system continues to function and judges have this independence and judges have this role that they can play, there is a whole other side of the state playing out, which is closer to that idea of a police state. And that's the realm in which these decrees often are what makes the difference, where Hitler can give a direct order to Himmler, and Himmler, as head of the SS, can institute things like new camps in the East. People are being deported. People are almost never deported by an act of a court. In fact, here's an ironic thing. The best way for a Jew to be protected, it turns out, as we enter especially the period of World War II, is if he comes before a court and the judge decides to sentence him to prison. And then he ends up in the prison, the standard prison of the German judicial system, and he may very well stay there with hardly anybody noticing him. He's essentially safe in prison. Whereas if the police pick you up and give you to the SS, you could end up deported, you could end up in Dachau, you could end up beaten to death, and in all likelihood no judge is going to bother crossing that long road from the judicial state on the one hand, the state of laws, to the police state on the other. And so we talk about this as a dual state. Law is continuing to function, laws still matter, but the police has its own zone of extraordinary power, and that's the SS, and that's the police state. Yeah?
Wasn't rule by decree a common practice in the latter years of the 20s, whether it was the Social Democrats in power, or whether it was the Conservatives in power, or anybody else, where you constitutionally had to get permission from the President, Hindenburg, in order to carry these things out with limited scope. And-
Right.
But how did this evolve into, and this is different from Hitler saying, do this, do that, I'm the Fuhrer, and whatever I say,
Yeah.
wasn't this an evolution from the constitutional decrees with
Yeah.
the presidents say so, and the decrees that followed from the Enabling Act?
Yeah. So this is where it starts getting really muddy, but I'll do the best I can to explain this. So the Weimar Constitution has its infamous Article 48, which says that in a case of emergency, the Reich president, who was directly elected by the people and was distinct from the Reich chancellor, who was created through parliamentary processes, that the Reich president could step up and make an emergency decree evoking Article 48, and that would allow him, for a limited period of time, to rule without needing to have a governmental majority. And Hindenburg, in 1930, well, really already in 1930, 31, as a result of the Great Depression, started using that Article 48. And so in the last 2 to 3 years of the Weimar Republic, there was a lot getting done by decree, because Hindenburg had taken on these emergency powers. He had invoked Article 48. In fact, he invoked it 3 times. So that's another use of the word decree. It's right. It means that they didn't necessarily, and a lot of this was all about stuff that will be very familiar to us today. It was about austerity, because it being in a depression, they thought the best way to get out of the depression was to impose policies of economic austerity. People hated that. They were cutting government jobs, they were cutting government funding, and to deal with the resistance to this policy, Hindenburg used the emergency decree. It didn't work because austerity policies, as we, I hope, all agree, never do work under those circumstances, and in fact the economy just got worse and worse. But that's another sense in which decrees were already being used before Hitler. That's kind of a different point than what I was making, which is about these Hitler decrees that were destined for the police, and that allowed the police to operate, and the judges would never get involved with police operations unless they happened to be courageous enough to say, what are they doing? And I'm going to look into this, and I'm going to call it out. It's I hope this is all coming across too as a lesson in the fragility of our legal systems, right? The legal system functioned great when the judges were willing to peer their nose into what the police were doing, but there was no requirement for them to do that. Nobody had the right to demand that of a judge, and as the Third Reich unfolded, judges, for whatever reason, were less and less willing to do that. Lothar Kreislich being a really rare example of somebody that, wait, how do I keep doing this? So if this works, there's actually one last thing I wanted to show you. The other side of this, so on the one hand you've got this functioning court system, which in many ways just keeps doing what it's doing all the way through down to the final days of the Third Reich. And then you've got this police state first under Goering, who as Minister of the Interior takes over the police and uses the police, and in fact deputizes these stormtroopers to work with the police. And then it's under Himmler, who creates this whole new organization, the SS, which just grows and grows and becomes, in some sense, the most powerful institution in the Third Reich. So these separate tracks, the justice system and the police system. And then, famously, towards the end of the war, they're relying more and more on a whole nother thing, which is the people's courts. So they create these kangaroo courts. They are under a very notorious, extraordinarily racial fanatic, a Nazi fanatic by the name of Roland Freisler, who's pictured there in the middle. And these courts, I think, have muddied our picture of the Third Reich, because when people think of justice in the Third Reich, often the first thing they imagine is this, which is these people's courts. They were important because they're the courts that try people accused of treason. And so the most famous case of this is in the July 1944 conspiracy, where a bunch of officers and some private citizens try to kill Hitler. They fail, they're arrested, and they are brought before this special tribunal. And in many ways, this tribunal functions like a caricature of Nazi justice, because there is no due process at all. There is no proper defense representation. And what you have is a judge like Freisler sitting on the bench and literally hectoring defendants, humiliating defendants, using this court simply as a political realm in order to make a message. And I think just as Lothar Kreisich was the exception that proves the rule about judges not being generally very courageous, I think Freisler and the People's Courts are the exception that prove the rule that this is what a truly ideological court looks like, but that was not most German courts. This was a very special court in Berlin and Munich, and it was there in order to try people of treason. So, in many ways, it's important to the story. I don't want to diminish the importance of these courts, but I think the danger, the risk is that some people think this is what Nazi justice looked like. It was just this crazy guy screaming at defendants, when in fact this was really an unusual circumstance. Obviously, trying to murder Hitler would be nice if lots of people had tried that, but that was a pretty rare occurrence that happened that we couldn't draw.
Who created them? I mean, how
Oh, Hitler created them. Now, if this works, I can actually show you. There's actually a actual footage from the courts online. And we'll see if, I'm not even sure.
Is that a link? Is that picture?
It's a link. Will that work?
So
Will
you
it?
use the mouse?
Yeah.
And click on.
Oh, I guess, okay. No, it didn't work. Okay. Well, it's all over YouTube. Also, if any of you saw the movie of the about the White Rose, the new one that came out. There's two movies. There's one that was made in the 80s. These are about the young medical students and their families in Munich who very courageously leafleted the university with anti-Hitler messages, and then they were brought before this very court. And the original movie is good, but it doesn't go much into their experience in the court. The new movie, which is in German but was released, I think, in the United States as well, actually uses the transcript from the court, and you get and this and what the other stuff that's online really gives you a sense of just the fanaticism behind this version of Nazi justice, which literally in the clip that I was going to show you, and it's my screw up, I think that it's not coming through. There was a man who was part of the July 44 conspiracy, who was a count and had actually a large plantation way out east. And the Nazis had murdered Jews and Poles on his plantation. They'd actually used it as a staging ground, and it had killed people. And standing before this tribunal, having been tortured, having been abused, now being shouted at, he had the remarkable wherewithal to stand there and actually say, I did this because of the murders that I saw in the East. And he uses the word murder, and at that point, Roland Freisler goes absolutely just crazy, screaming at him, how dare you use the word murder, how dare you call it that, and it's just literally 5 minutes of just pure hectoring. You're probably lucky I'm not making you watch it, it's all in German too, but it is on YouTube, and that's actual footage from Freisler. But I still think that's the extreme. For the most part, just to close, you know, I think law continues to play an important role all the way down to the end of the Third Reich, because people wanted to believe that they still lived in a society of laws. And I think that allowed for a sheen of legitimacy. And that if the Nazi Reich had been a police state, if it had truly been just maniacs like Freisler yelling at defendants or policemen knocking down doors constantly without any attention to law, I don't know if it would have had the wherewithal to continue as long as it did. I don't know if it would have been able to gather the support that it did. I don't know in the end if it would have been as effective in rounding people up, targeting them for murder, and leading us on that path towards the final solution. So thank you, and I'll be happy to take it.
Were these courts, I'm sorry, go ahead, Felicia.
Can that happen here?
Can it happen here?
Yes.
I think it can happen anywhere. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw the stuff that Tim Snyder, the Yale historian, he's been intervening in contemporary politics, which is probably always a dangerous thing for historians to do. But Tim is a real expert also is really an expert on Eastern Europe and the Holocaust there. And his biggest message about present day politics is just reminding us to support institutions and to remember how institutions really matter. And one of the things that and this is probably controversial, but one of the things I feel about Germans in the period before the Third Reich is I think they went a little too far in criticizing the judges. I think they forgot how important the courts were fundamentally as bulwarks of the legal order. And already before Hitler came to power, people weren't providing the same support for the judicial system as they once had because they felt like it had been corrupted, that it was no longer what it used to be. And so I think that that's an important message, that however flawed our institutions are, no matter what you feel about where the Supreme Court is headed or how you feel about the judges that have ended up on U.S. district courts, that the institutions themselves have to be recognized as so vital for the health of your democracy. And I think that's probably the most important takeaway for me in terms of where we're headed. Yeah.
Were these courts in every city and town, or were there a few of them, or was there one of them? How is this organized?
Yeah, the people's courts were, I believe they were only in Berlin and Munich, but I could be wrong. I think those were the two locations for them. Again, these guys are all over the internet. I mean, people love to talk about Freisler because he is such a nutcase. And it seems so black and white. When you see him up there dressed as a judge, but with a Nazi swastika on his lapel, screaming at defendants who've been tortured already, that's a very powerful image, and it looks like it stands for justice under the Nazis. I can't tell you how many historians have published books with that on the cover, and I really object to that because I think it makes it seem like that's what judges were like in the Third Reich. And that's almost comforting, right? If you think all the judges were maniac Nazis, then you kind of don't realize how important all those other judges were who maybe weren't even Nazis and yet compromised with the system and didn't, stand up for their principles. Yeah.
You mentioned Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution. I'm just peripherally, familiar with it, but to my knowledge, it didn't include any civil rights as we know them today. And there was no Bill of Rights. So the guarantees that exist today, in answer to your first question of can it happen here, those guarantees didn't exist, did they?
Well, I wouldn't quite put it that way. I mean, again, you could go online and look at the Weimar Constitution, and it's in there. There's English versions. One of the things you'll notice actually is an insanely long list of rights, like really long. And I think the biggest flaw of that Constitution was not that there weren't any rights, but that there were so many rights that they kind of almost become meaningless, because some of the rights were like, you have the right to housing. What does that mean? How do I enforce that? You have the right to health. Now, as a general principle, okay, great. But in terms of enforceability, that's where the Constitution was lacking. So I wouldn't say that it lacked a list of rights. I'd say that it didn't have good, clear procedural guarantees for how you, in fact, achieve your rights. And that's where, like, when I talk about the fact they don't have habeas corpus. So I would hope and I'm sure this isn't true, but I would hope that if I disappear in the middle of the night, that, you know, my wife can go to a judge, and the judge will be legally obligated to find out, you know, who schlepped Warren Rosenblum off in the middle of the night. And that's a legal procedural requirement. Whereas in Germany, it's just an option. You know, the relationship between the judges and the administrative state are very fuzzy. And so that, I'd say, is the biggest flaw of the Weimar Constitution, that it doesn't clarify how you get your rights. You know, how do you make your claim if you have a right against, you know, arbitrary arrest? How does that work? You know, and if I can't count on a judge intervening to find out where I am, then that's meaningless, right? So I think that I would shift the emphasis towards that procedural issue.
A lot of us have our images of judges through the movie Judgment at Nuremberg. And I'm just curious, I mean, who were these judges? And what were these trials? What were they actually tried for?
Yeah.
I have no idea, but that's
Yeah.
our image from at least those of us of a certain
Yeah.
age, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was one of the trials after World War II was of judges and lawyers, and it was not part of the original Nuremberg Tribunal. So it was not. This is getting confusing, but there was the International Tribunal at Nuremberg, which tried the major war criminals, and that was the one where the Russians and the Americans and the British were all together. And then later, there were trials of doctors, trials of lawyers and judges, and one other category that I'm not remembering, and that was the Americans in their zone of occupation. And my recollection is that it was kind of a fiasco. It really didn't, it wasn't very well carried out. The defendants weren't all that well chosen. A few people were convicted, and then the Germans immediately let them out when they took over sovereignty in I believe in the 50s. So that was really kind of a sideshow. But that is a great movie, and it's funny. I forgot about that it is actually about a judge who kind of was unnecessarily harsh, and that in that sense does capture a very realistic situation. Very moving, and also gets into all those philosophical issues.
What was the
about
title?
what is law?
Judgment at Nuremberg.
Judgment at Nuremberg?
The movie Judgment at Nuremberg by
Yes.
Abby
Mann.
Abby Mann.
Did they have a copy of this library?
Yeah, no, it's an amazing film. It's an incredible actor, Judy Garland,
Spencer Tracy.
Spencer Tracy,
Montgomery Clift.
James Captain Kirk is in it.
My question is, what was the payoff for this kangaroo court?
Yeah.
And how do you pronounce that?
Oh, Volksgerichtshof, but yeah, it's just People's Court. People's Court.
But what did they get out of it?
Yeah.
It was a civilian job?
Yeah. No, so this court was really, these were the hardcore fanatic Nazis, and their job was to scare the crap out of everybody so that you would not mess anymore with the regime and consider trying to assassinate Hitler or do any other kind of protest.
But what did they get for it?
What did they get for it?
Yeah.
Oh, they were ideologues. They believed they were serving their country, serving the Fuhrer. I think Freisler was a true believer. I mean, Freisler was somebody who, he'd actually been a successful lawyer before 33, hardcore Nazi from day one, was a member of the Stormtroopers, fought with that other guy, Gertner. I mean, so the interesting thing about the man in the middle is that he really was in the middle. He was the Minister of Justice. He wanted to protect the independence of the courts. He wanted courts to continue to operate the way they always had, and he had to fight off Freisler. I mean, Gertner was not in favor of creating special tribunals. Like, he wanted to keep the courts the way they were. So that, you know, and then on the left is Goering and Himmler, who of course could care less about the courts. They're just going to operate with their police troops doing as they see fit. So you've kind of got three separate ideas, and that's typical of the Third Reich too. The Third Reich, we often use the word polycratic now to describe the Third Reich rather than totalitarian. There was always competition. It was very chaotic. Hitler loved to get different opinions in the room and pit people against each other, and then just make a decision based on his so-called instincts, you know? So, that's not unusual. You have Gertner and Freisler kind of arguing with each other. Yeah.
Article 48 evidence access by the president. Did Hitler do it with his chancellor? Is that illegal?
Well, he didn't need to, because then they had the enabling law. Once
Could you
they got the
repeat the
enabling
question?
So whether Hitler used Article 48. And once, that's kind of the enabling law sort of took care of that, because it gave him all the powers of Article 48 in perpetuity, whereas Article 48 would have meant renewing it. I think it's every 6 months, or I'm not sure. But you know, Hitler definitely hated the Weimar Constitution, and as far as he was concerned, with the enabling law, the Constitution was dead. And you know, technically it was still in the books, but he wasn't going to worry about whether he was violating constitutional norms. And most lawyers weren't even thinking about it either. They had other things. You know, nobody was standing up saying, "Hey, you violated Article such and such of the Constitution." So in that sense, I mean, the legal state really is out the window. Should we have a last question? Yeah.
Could you identify the people in the picture?
Well, that's Himmler closest to us, and then Goering is next to Himmler. And beyond that, I really don't know, except that they're wearing battle helmets, so I guess this is after the war has started. But Himmler and Goering, you know, Goering was the interior minister, so he was in charge of the regular police forces, and Himmler really built the SS into this extraordinary, really, it's a police force is what it is, a police force with absolute lack of any accountability, right, and really independence. I'm happy to hang around and answer any individual questions, but thank you again for having me.